So now that we've created our turbulent fire shader, next we're going to take a look at rendering out a flipbook texture, arranging that in Photoshop for use inside of our game engine. Typically when you have flipbook texture, what you would see is something like this grid pattern here. You would have your first frame of your animation in the top left hand corner and the final frame of your animation in the bottom right hand corner. We're going to be using an 8x8 texture, which means that we get 64 frames. And in order to make a loopable animation, we're going to have to make some adjustments to our time slider inside of my LT. So open up our animation preferences by pressing the menu icon down near our time slider here on the right. And we're going to want to adjust the time attribute in our settings category, so just go ahead and select that. We have a bunch of options in our drop down list here. I've done some quick math, and the value that is going to serve us best is 16 frames per second, so I'm just going to go down and grab that and hit save. Our 64 frames is evenly divisible by 16, so that's where that comes from. The next thing we have to do is adjust one of our parameters inside of ShaderFX. We can close down our preferences here and just go ahead and open up ShaderFX. I'm going to select my mesh here, go to my attribute editor, and hit open ShaderFX. Just exit this group. And the value we're going to want to adjust is in the X distortion group, so just dive into that. Select our UV panner here and change our speed U to 0.25 instead of 0.1. Now our panner will complete its full loop at 64 frames because remember the time aspect of our shader is based on the time FPS we have set in the animation preferences. So 16 times 4 is 64. So now if we close down ShaderFX and make sure that our time slider is set correctly here, we have frame 1 at the beginning, so I'm just going to bring our start time to frame 1, make sure that our playback is actually on frame 1, and our end time is at 64, and the end of the animation is also at 64. Now if we were to play the animation, it should be looping, and you can just make sure that that's actually working by adding an extra frame to the end of your time slider here, so change this to 65, and if we were to bounce back between the end frame and the start frame of our time slider here, you shouldn't see a change on your shader. I can just change that back to 64 now, and this to 64, and we should be good to go to render out our flipbook. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go to Create Cameras and just select Camera, and we're going to want to translate it back a little bit so our entire plane will be showing up in the view of our camera. We can just double check that by going to Panels, Perspective, and grabbing the Camera 1 that we've just created, look through that, and move it a little bit so that it's more in the center of the viewport. Next we're going to want to go to our camera attributes and change our camera to orthographic. So under orthographic views, just click that on, and now we'll be looking flat at that plane. Can bring it in a little bit so it's tight, nice and tight. Now we can bring up our play blast settings by right clicking on your time slider here and grabbing the little square next to the play blast, which is the last option on our drop down here. So just bring that up, and we're going to want to turn off show ornament, so we don't want any of our HUD showing up on our render. Just change the format to image. We want our encoding to be PNG, so we'll just go down to that and select that. Our scale we want to be 1. Our display size we can use custom, and we'll keep it at 256 by 256 for now. And our frame padding, we're probably going to only want 2 zeros for that. We're going to want to turn on Save to File here. I'm just going to browse. Create a new folder in our images subdirectory here and call it Flame Play Blast. Change our files of type to PNG and just call this flame _01. Press save, hit apply, and now we'll render out our play blast. So there's way too much of our viewport showing up on the outside of our plane here, so we just redo that. Just close F-check here and zoom in. We can render that out again by just right clicking on your time slider and pressing play blast again. That'll bring it up. Looks like we've got a little bit more. So just close that down once again. Bring it in a little bit more, and just hitting the play blast once again. And now it looks pretty good. Now that we have our 64 PNG frame files, we want to arrange them all into a sprite sheet. I use a program called Sprite Sheet Packer to do this. It's a lightweight program that I grabbed on Codeplex here, so you can go ahead and download and install that if you want. I'm just going to jump into that. It's a pretty basic program. You just select the Add Images button here, navigate to your frame folder, just grab all of these and hit open, and there they are. We're going to want our image padding set at 0, and the width of our map is going to be 2048 by 2048 because 256 times our 8 frames on a row is 2048, obviously. So I'm just going to change that. Set our image file here. Just call this turbulent packed. Just hit save. Make sure generate map is selected and just press build sprite sheet. That'll take a few seconds. And press OK. And now we can jump into Photoshop and import that in. And there it is, our Fire sprite sheet. Looks pretty good. Next we're going to take a look at getting this imported and set up in our game. I'm going to be using the Unreal Development Kit, but of course you can import this into Unity or another game engine if you like. I'm just going to jump over to that now. We're not going to go over the UI or anything like that. We're going to simply be making our flipbook shader here. So the first thing that we have to do is import our texture. So under the content browser, just press the import button here and navigate to your Flame Play Blast folder and just grab the Turbulent Fire Packed, select that and press open. That'll bring up the import texture settings. Under the package, we're just going to name this Turbulent Fire. Grouping, change that to textures, and the name we can leave at Turbulent Fire _ packed. Make sure compression no alpha is on because we don't have an alpha map. And the next thing we want to set is flipbook, so just turn that on. Everything else looks okay, and you can press OK. That'll import it. Next we have to adjust its settings, so just double click on the texture to bring up the texture properties. And under horizontal images we want to set that of course to 8. Vertical images also set that to 8. And our frame rate we can leave at 4 for now. We can adjust that later. Just press close. Next we want to create a material, so right click in the content browser, go to new material, and we're going to name that m_turbulent fire, and just press OK, and that'll bring up the material editor. Next, go back to the content browser, select your texture flipbook here, and go to your material editor here, and we can right click, go to texture, new flipbook sample, just drop that down, and we can grab the RGB value here and just plug that directly into our emissive of the preview material. And there it is. Of course it's playing a little bit slow. Like I said, we can adjust the frame rate, so just bring this over, bring up the texture settings again, and we can adjust our frame rate to what we think looks best. Let's try 16. That looks pretty good. If we bring it up to maybe 30, that looks pretty good. So we can press close and bring our material editor back over. So next we're going to drop down a plane. So in the content browser, if you just go to Engine and type in plane into the search, you'll get the text prop plane static mesh. Just left click that and drag that into the viewport here. bring it up, rotate that around. We can grab our turbulent fire here, just clear the search settings, and apply that material to our plane by just left clicking and dragging and dropping that onto our plane here. Of course, we haven't compiled our material yet, so just jump back to the material editor and press the green checkbox. And there it is. So of course it is black here on the edges. We don't really want that. And in order to fix that, we just change the blend mode of our material to blend underscore additive. And that means that the black values of our material will become transparent, and just recompile that again. And there's your flame. The directional light in this default template map is fairly strong, so it might look a little bit strange in the regular unshadowed areas. But if you just bring it over to a shadowed area, for example near the cube here, and bring it back down onto the floor, change its scale. I'm going to make it half in the Draw 3D here. And just bring it back down. It's starting to look pretty good. So there you go. I've just moved our flame plane to another map with some better lighting, and it looks pretty nice. I hope you enjoyed creating this flipbook shader and texture. I think it's a great way to leverage ShaderFX and MyLT to create some cool looking effects at a low performance cost. You could cut resources even more by reducing the texture size of your packed texture, especially if you plan to use it on a mobile game where the fire will take up only a few pixels on the screen. You could go ahead and adjust the effect more if you like, using a custom mesh to define some three-dimensionality, or perhaps using a tiling-based flame texture to create a repeatable pattern that you can use to populate your level with lots of fire. We've created a very versatile shader here, and with a few texture swaps it can become something else entirely, like perhaps a magic spell effect or an animated snow or dust. Next we'll have a small section on adjusting the color of our effect without having to create a new static flame texture. So I'm back inside of MyLT here, and we're going to talk a little bit about adjusting the color of our flame here. I'm going to go ahead and open ShaderFX. Typically you might say, well, that should be pretty easy, I just use a multiply and a color node, and we can adjust the color that way. But it's not really true, especially if your texture map is very saturated like this one is. I'll show you an example of what would happen if I drop down a math multiply and then just grab a values color, plug our fire sprite here into the first value of our multiply, and grab the color and plug that into the second value of our multiply. We can grab that result, plug that into the emissive. I can just change the color to maybe this blue here. It's not really showing up blue, it's a little bit of a green color. There isn't that nice gradient of color that we have in the fire sprite here inside of this tinted blue version here. So to fix this, it's pretty simple. Essentially what we're going to do is desaturate the flame and then use what's called a lookup table to define the new gradient. So we're actually going to create a very simple example first, and then we'll implement that into our fire here. So the first thing I want to do is just delete these multiply and color here. And I'm going to drop down a new texture, so shader nodes, textures, texture map. And I'm going to navigate to my circle gradient PNG that I've just created and hit open. And just plug that into the color of our emissive. And of course we have the black and white texture here. So let's say that we wanted to adjust that to a custom gradient. So inside of Photoshop, I'm going to create a new document. So new, the width I'm going to put to 256 and the height I'm going to put at 32, and just press OK. And here we're going to create a gradient. So I'm just going to press the gradient tool here and bring up our gradient editor. And I'm going to create maybe a different color here. So let's go from maybe blue to purple. And maybe another color in the middle here. Let's say green. Just press OK. Drag that out. and I can save this as a PNG and call this Lookup Table _01 and just hit save. Now we can jump back into MyLT, and we want that custom gradient lookup table to be applied to our black and white circle here. So let's drop down a new texture node. So under Hardware Shader Nodes, Textures, Texture Map, and just navigate to our lookup table. Bring that out, and what we're going to actually end up wanting to do is use our texture map here of our circle black and white gradient as the UVs for our texture map lookup table here. So to do that, we can drop down a vector construct. So under values, vector construct, and we want to use the red channel of our gradient here, so red, and we want to put that into the X input of our vector construct, and grab the red also and plug that into the Y input on our vector construct, and that will give us a float2 value that we can use for our UVs. So I can just grab that, plug that into our UV input on our gradient, whoops, and now you can see in the preview almost immediately that we're using that texture map to create a custom color set. But it is repeating, and we don't really want this purple at the edges. We actually want this blue value to go all the way to the edge like the black value does in our gradient circle here. So to do that, you just grab your texture map, go to the sampler U coordinate, and change that to clamp on both the U and V. Now if we were to plug that into our emissive, we have our custom color lookup for our circle gradient. And let's say you wanted a different set of colors, you can just go into Photoshop, create a new gradient, like for example this purple to orange, drag that out, just save that as a different lookup table. So let's call this 02, press OK, and change our texture map here to 02 instead. And now we've got that orange to purple color instead. Hopefully you can start to see how cool this actually is. The color of a flame is highly dependent on what is actually burning. Therefore it's important to create a specific color set in order to sell whatever effect you're trying to emulate. Let's say you can't find the fire sprite texture that has the right color, or you don't want to keep adjusting the color of your fluid sim. For example, road flares like this one have a very specific white and red glow. I've actually sampled these colors and created a custom gradient in Photoshop here, and we're going to use that now in our flame. So first let's desaturate our flame by using the desaturate node under lighting. So just drop that down, grab the color output of our fire sprite, plug that in. And next we're going to want to grab that vector construct to create a float2. So values, vector construct, and plug that in so the desaturate color goes into the X and Y. And finally let's drop down a texture map and grab that flare lookup table. So textures, texture map, just going to move things over, delete these example ones up here, and I'm going to put lookup table in the name here, grab the path, and grab flare lookup table _01, hit open, and let's plug that in. So the float2 goes into the UV of our lookup table. Oops. And let's remember that we want to set our bounds here to clamp on the U and V. And we can plug that color into the emissive input on our traditional game surface shader. Now we can actually take this a step further and control where the gradient is taking into effect using a power and multiply, and we can adjust those so that the white of the road flare actually shows up a little bit better. So let's go to the desaturate color here and drag this over a little bit, and we want to drop down a math multiply. So grab the desaturate color in, plug that into the value of our multiply, and let's grab a float value, so values float, plug that into the other value of our multiply, and we're going to want to grab a power, so math pow, plug that on also, make some more room, and drop another value float down, and plug that into the power. And now we can put this back into our vector construct in the X and Y input. And now we can start to adjust these two values here. So let's say 1.25, maybe 1.5. That's starting to look okay. Let's adjust the power here. Maybe 0.8, maybe 0.65. That's starting to look okay. So I think that looks pretty good. We can actually take this lookup table and also expose that to Maya so that we can quickly swap in and out our lookup tables. So now if I close down ShaderFX, we've completely altered the look of our flame texture. And now it starts to look like something else entirely, like it's a different thing that's actually burning. And you can actually take that and just export that as a flipbook texture also. And you can start to build up a library of effects textures for your game. So that about wraps it up for this section of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, be sure to give us a shout on the forums.